So tonight we are at Grangetown Pavilion with the author Sophie Buchaillard and Eric Ngalle Charles, who will be guiding us through Sophie's debut novel, This Is Not Who We Are, which deals with the Rwandan genocide of the 1990s and its aftermath. Our guests are going to have a conversation about the book. There'll be a few readings, after which there's going to be a chance for some of you to ask questions if you wish. So get thinking about what they're saying. If there's anything you want to quiz them about, make a note of it and you'll get a chance to ask them. We should be finished at about 7:30, maybe a little bit later, depending on how the conversation goes. But there will also be a chance after the event to have a chat to Sophie and Eric. They've got some books to sell. I gather Sophie has a 2-for-1 deal, which she was happy to tell you about. Yeah, we need to be out of here at 8. That's the sort of cut-off point for this later. So, born in Paris, Sophie Buchaillard moved to Wales in 2001 and now lives in Penarth. She writes travel literature, fiction and short stories. She's recently finished her PhD at Cardiff University, where she is a tutor of creative writing. Her short stories and essays have appeared in Wales Arts Review and the Byline Times, and Is Not Who We Are is published by Seren Books and was one of their top 10 novels of 2022, according to the Wales Arts Review. Sophie will be in conversation with our special guest, Eric Ngalle Charles, poet, playwright, and human rights activist. His memoir, I, Eric Ngalle, recounts his migration from his birthplace in the Cameroon via Russia and finally to Europe, where he finally settled here in Cardiff. He sits on the boards of Literature Wales and the Aberystwyth Arts Centre Advisory Group, and he's working on a PhD currently at King's College London. His latest poetry collection, Homeland, is also out in Seren Books. I'll leave you with Sophie and Eric. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that it?
That's it. On,
yeah. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I think we met a couple of years ago or something like that. You told me about your book, and the first thing I asked you was, have you read The Girl Who Smiles Beats?
Yes.
Clementine Maria. And you said yes. So like, okay, I'm looking forward to reading your finished work. And This Is Not Who We Are. It's a wonderful book. And I'm just going to put this out there. Most times when I read books about Africa from European authors, I have a bit of panic. Because for too long we've had this continent of Africa being looked through colonial and stereotypical lenses. So I had 3 books. I had Damien Barr's book, You'll Be Safe There, and I read it, beautifully written. Horatio Clare's book, The Single Swallow, wonderful. And I read yours. The beautiful thing about this book is once you finish it, you remember all the characters. Yeah, so thank you very much for that literary pilgrimage. The continent of Africa has been a fandango for many European nations. Cameroon, the Portuguese were there. They left, the Germans came. They left, the English and the French came. And there are these kind of legacies that is taking place. But here, we chose the 1994 Rwandan genocide. And the book is beautifully written because you told the stories through the prism of children. My first question for you, I guess, is why did you decide on Rwanda?
Because although this is a novel, it is based on my personal experience of age 16, I think pen friend named Victoria, who was from Rwanda. Our school organized it in the 1990s. This is a thing that school did. They find people who lived in different countries or different circumstances from yours, and then they organized for you to write letters to each other in order to broaden your horizon. And to remember, it was pre the internet, pre-YouTube, all the things that are giving you access to places afar, and it was a way to get a different perspective than your own as a child. And so my school arranged for me to start a correspondence with a girl named Victoria. And all I knew about her was that she was from a country in Africa called Rwanda, and I didn't know much more at the time. So we started writing to each other, and we wrote between the spring of 1994 and the end of the summer of 1994, at which point she stopped writing. And what I knew but probably didn't fully appreciate at the time was that over that period there was genocide happening in Rwanda, where she was from, and that when she was writing to me, she was not in Rwanda per se. She was in the refugee camp of Lake Kivu in Goma, in a camp, and she was separated from her parents with her brothers, and it was the nuns who were trying to organize the children there, who had arranged for my school and the school in account to arrange correspondence. And recently I was interviewed by a BBC author, and I told that story, and for about 3 weeks after that I got people contacting me saying, I had a pen friend in 1994. And in some cases it was amazing, because I met a lady called Sylvia, who was having a correspondence with somebody called Eric, actually. And Eric was in the same camp as Victoria, and they corresponded, and they are still in touch today. Eric went back to Rwanda and has family, and she said when she read the article in the BBC article, she went into her loft and got all the letters down, and we spent an hour on the phone where she read me the letters there. The two of them had been exchanging over time, and so we've been trying to get in touch with Eric to find out whether he ever came across Victoria and knows anything about it, and that through that route, as many other routes, I can find out what happened to her, because we're now almost 30 years later, and I don't know what happened to my Victoria. So that's why we run that.
This is not who we are, author Sophie Buchaillard. We start in the comfort of our homes, somewhere in Europe, with Iris. Iris is washing, she's looking at the washing machine going round and round. And then all of a sudden we are in a school, and we meet Sister Agnes. And he describes Sister Agnes that she had an inflated buttocks, like the cow. Read it. The language is beautiful. So this is the thing. Once you read this book, you start seeing plenty of Sister Agneses around. Because
Yes.
I love it. But you deal with the characters independently. So we have Iris, we have Victoria, we have Paul and Benjamin.
Yes.
Why through the prism of children?
Partly because my initial perspective of the genocide in Rwanda was through my own perspective as a child, and also because a lot of what happened to children, and who were not in control of their fates. And I did a lot of research for the book, and I got in touch with some survivors. The genocide was 30 years ago, so the majority of survivors I spoke to were children at the time. And often what happened is their parents didn't survive, and they somehow survived. So all the perspective that were passed on to me, all those stories that were passed on to me were all stories of people who at the time who had children memories of the events. And in fact, Claver was an author I mentioned in the acknowledgement who really helped me. Yesterday in Kigali launched a book called Transmitting Memories, which is about creating those memories for the next generation. So children, his own children, but other children in Rwanda, have an understanding of what happened, because 30 years is a long time.
It is a long time. Actually, it's not a long time, because I'll just feed in a personal anecdote there. During the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the Cameroonian government had an open border policy for Rwandan refugees.
Yes.
I didn't know that. I only found out when I came to Cardiff in July 99. I was stranded outside Cardiff bus station, and I saw this black guy. So I'm thinking, oh, he looks suspiciously like a Cameroonian. So I approached him, and he spoke such fast English, I didn't have a clue what he was saying. The only thing I heard was Birmingham, and then he walked away and looked at me, and then I saw bus number 29 from Barry Island, and there was a black guy on this bus. So I approached him, and he started speaking in French. Yes, he said he was from Rwanda. And the irony of ironies, what started the Rwandan genocide was the assassination of Emmanuel Habyarimana. And this guy that I met in Cardiff, his name was Emmanuel Habyarimana. Yes. So memory serves us, memory lingers. So it could have happened 30 years ago, but through your letters and coincidences, you've brought this to us. And that is the power that you have as a writer. Now, I'm just going to have to flash forward a little bit. Because now we are dealing with these incidences. And then we'll find a character somewhere in London. And you meet a taxi driver from Cameroon.
Yes.
So why don't you just veer off a little bit? Talk about the French in Cameroon. I was quite excited. I'm like, okay, this is Sophie's going to and you just left me in the taxi and I'm hanging.
That'd be a different book. I think, so for a bit of historical background, so Rwanda, so like Cameroon, Rwanda was a German colony for a while, and then the German left and the Belgian took over. And the Belgian introduced in Rwanda an identity card, which was a similar system that the Belgian had back home. And it was an identity card that defined people's ethnic groups, because that's what the Belgian had. Whether they were valid or not, it was indicated on the identity card. What happened in the case of Rwanda is that they took words which put on the identity card, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, which were economic words that describe what people did for a living, and used that as an ethnic, and froze people in time as being this identity, this fake identity which they made up, which was then used by the far right 60 years later in order to justify the genocide. I've lost track of Cameroon. So, whilst I was doing my research, I did a lot of reading, and there was a lot of reports that were in English and a lot of reports that were in French about what happened in Rwanda in 1994. And what struck me is the language was different, depending whether you were reading the story in English or the story in French. They were different narratives, they were telling different stories. And as I unraveled that, I became aware of the role that the Belgian had played in setting the circumstances which facilitated the Rwandan genocide, but also I became aware of the fact that the French government of the time, for a reason we can go back in, which are linked to Cameroon as well, were trying to use Rwanda in order to retain an area of influence Africa after the end of the colonies. And because Rwanda, where it is in Africa, there's a line of English-speaking and French-speaking Africa, and Rwanda was at the cusp between the two. Yeah. So the French saw Rwanda as this kind of they had this policy called France-Afrique, one word, which was intended on creating new links with African countries, which they thought were strategically significant, and they were after French-speaking countries, and so Cameroon is another case. Yeah. So the reason why my taxi driver is from Cameroon is because I wanted to have a translate to back there. There's other countries where France.
I love it.
But yeah, it would be another book.
So basically, in that context, then.
Yeah.
Chinua Achebe, when Chinua Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart, he said, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. But in Rwanda, it wasn't the case of just two elephants fighting. It was there was some geographical thing, big powers. But the man in a pub somewhere in Ely or in Grangetown will not understand. They will just think the Rwandan genocide was the Hutus, between the Hutus and the Tutsis.
Yeah.
But once I was reading it, you brought this fact that there are 10 things, circumstances that are like a template for genocide to occur. Can you please enlighten the audience for this?
Oh God, I can't remember the 10.
Not the 10, but the circumstances, yeah.
Yeah, so there's research that showed that there's 10 criteria, 10 things that can happen in a society which are predictor of a genocide, and they were all they had all been identified by international institutions. In the case of Rwanda, so the United Nations, but a lot of countries that had interest in the area had the information. They knew that there was a danger that the country was going that way, and yet no action was taken. In fact, when you look at the reports, it took an unusual long time for the United Nations to react and declare a genocide. They hesitated for ages. The genocide lasted 100 days and 800,000 people died. So so clearly something was happening. But there was a reluctance. There was a reluctance from the international communities to name it as such, and part of that was because the press at the time, the international press at the time, misrepresented what was happening and described it as a clash between two ethnic groups, which it wasn't.
Yeah. So this is the beauty of this book. For those in academia, you can use it for research. For somebody, if you want to write fiction, you can read this book. For simplicity, you can also read this book. But then it opens one's eye to this idea of divide and rule, us and them. Because once you are able to divide people, then telling them to kill each other becomes administrative. It's a case of shoveling sand onto a wheelbarrow. And it works. So now, through a picture, Damien Barr goes to South Africa. Through letters, we start corresponding with Victoria. So can you read us your first letter or Victoria's first letter to you? I think that's on page 15. I think.
Yes, it is. Shall I read both?
Please, yeah.
To put it in context, I was in class and somebody asked if there were any volunteers to be pen friends. I volunteered. I then went to see my catechism teacher, who was in Catholic school, and they gave me this envelope with a name and an address, and they said, go ahead and write. So the first letter was, my name is Victoria Umawa Oro. I am from Rwanda, but at the moment I am staying with the sisters in Zaire, which is the former name of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The sisters are very nice to us. They teach us. They say we can write, so I can practice my French. I want to become a translator, you see. I speak Kinyarwanda, French, and English. And so I replied to her, and then shortly after, a few weeks later, another really short letter arrived, and so it used to arrive on tracing paper that had been torn off a book, written in turquoise ink. I have two brothers. They're in the camp with me. We were separated from our parents on the way here, and the sisters are helping us to locate them. So the letters are fairly close to the original letters.
Yeah.
Obviously, the rest of the story is
Thank you for sharing that. So through a simple correspondence, we can travel into these spaces. Now I'm just thinking about Iris. Iris, you're sitting down, you're looking at the washing machine spinning. You take Ophelia to a rainbow nursery school. Then there's a little girl, Victoria, somewhere in Zaire, in a camp. I mean, as a writer, how do you navigate these two worlds?
I think I was. So the character of Iris is a recently mother whose daughter is about to start going to nursery, daughter Ophelia, and she's returning to work. She has worked in the past as a journalist, and she's looking for a project, and she sits in a cafe on her first day of freedom, having spent months changing nappies and prioritizing the kids. And the first thing that comes to mind is that child from her past, Victoria. And because she has now become a mother, she is the mother that is wondering what happened to that child. Not the 16-year-old pen friend anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the way in. And she becomes obsessed with finding out what happened to her pen friend years later, having not thought about it for a long time. And it is the fact of having a daughter herself, becoming a mother, that triggers a desire to find out what happened.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there are ways you can get into stories. So you have some writers will come to you and say, "Oh, Sophie, I have a writer's block." But something as simple as a correspondence, a letter, can take you to can be a doorway into this wonderful world. Now, move forward, and we find a scenario where we know that Victoria, Paul, something has happened to their mother, but you don't tell us. We left thinking our worst fears, but then you introduce a scenario where Paul, the last born, chops off the hand of Benjamin. I'm like, oh my. I'm not spoiling it. It is good, so don't worry about it. I'm just feeding you. And then Paul finds himself in the UK, place of comfort. And there is this question. I mean, if you go to some organizations in Cardiff who host displaced people, there's an easiness to say, like, you ask Paul the question, Paul, does it feel like home to you? And Paul says yes. Yeah. So how did you why did you come to that? That kind of conclusion? Like, Paul as a young boy, experiences trauma, chopped off his brother's hand, and he's home, away from home, but he testifies. So yeah.
Yes, I think when you talk to survivors about the genocide, there is still an impact now about the events that happened almost 30 years ago. And I wanted to explore that. One of the reasons I chose to write a novel rather than to write our story with Victoria is because the novel allowed me to go further and to look at further in time. And in particular, I wanted to look at what happens to the survivors once everybody else has forgotten. And Paul is a very young child when the genocide happens, and he witnessed a lot of horrors, bodies in the streets, pilot bodies in a camp, a lot of violence and errant violence around, committed by people that were previously his loved ones. And he then is able to come to the UK, and the mind of children does that, it builds a wall to protect him, so that he doesn't remember the life before. Whereas his sister Victoria, who's much older, remembers everything, and he's having to navigate the past and trying to reconcile what she remembers of the loss. Paul has locked everything away, so he's able to grow up seemingly a happy child in the UK. He goes to school, he has difficulties to adapt at first, but then everything is fine. Until he is confronted with his past, and then all goes tumbling down because the trauma was never addressed, the loss was never addressed,
and it cuts into the heart of this problem of displacement. When trauma occurs, it's like suddenly you have this blankness, only to remember later. Something terrible happens to Victoria. And I love Victoria's character. I'm like, come on, Sophie, you're not going to No, I'm not going to spoil it. You have to read the book. But arrival and departure means different things to different people. Some people never arrive.
Yes.
So effectively, Paul never arrives. Yeah.
Yes, but I think in some ways Victoria never arrives either.
Yeah.
I think neither of them arrived because neither of them chose to come to the UK. They ended up there through no fault of their own. And whether Paul realizes it or not, it is not home. And they live in a bubble of two. And I mean, there's a question of where is home and how do you reconcile the trauma, how do you live through the trauma, how do you survive the trauma, and in their case it is about finding their place, finding home, returning home.
So on every level, the book works. Character-wise, I went onto a writing pilgrimage. And then again, I come across a scenario where there's a taxi driver, but this time they're from Kurdistan.
Yeah.
And this guy starts telling you his own thing about his family, how long they've been in London. And I was thinking there's a laziness that we tend to do. Where people are, okay, so you've come to the UK, can you tell us what aspects of your memories? Not knowing what triggers.
Yeah.
Well, so you dealt with this question nicely. And there are angles that you can go with this book. You can write your own version of this book. So when Victoria finds herself in Zaire, you could explore the United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was killed in 1961, and this triggered the Congo crisis.
Yeah.
And it was only recently that Patrice Lumumba's teeth was returned to Congo. Also, in 1963, when Idi Amin was, a lot of Asians left, but there was a genocide that happened in Uganda. So you're in this middle,
Yes.
and you are talking about Rwandan genocide.
Yes.
So you could have gone into any angle, but why did you just narrow it to this specific genocide?
Because it's the one I had a connection to, so it was easier to get in. Because it's the one that was very well documented, so it was easier for me as an outsider to try and get a sense of what had happened, and because I was able to work with people in Rwanda in order to write it, to try and understand the perspective of the survivors. There was an element particularly that attracted me to Rwanda, which was the parallel I saw with things that were happening. So I wrote this in 2019, and at the time Donald Trump was in power. There was a lot of talks about fake news, and there was going back to that pattern of genocide that you talk about. Language dehumanization is something that is one of the final stages in the process. And in the case of Rwanda, a large portion of the population received its information through a state-owned radio, Radio-Télévision des Mille Collines, which slowly ramped up its hateful language to dehumanize the Tutsi. They used the term Inuensi, which means cockroaches, in order to refer to Tutsi people. And through a very well choreographed and well articulated campaign that lasted 60 years, they somehow managed to convince the majority of the population to murder their neighbors, their friends, people that were the same as they were, through this dehumanization. And at the time in 2019, watching Donald Trump in the States and watching debates about fake news, it chimed, it echoed. Watching debates about migration in the UK now, and
shall we just? Can you hear us? Okay.
Yeah. You can say I hear us. It's still happening now. So it was important to me to use that particular example because it's a very clear example of how the use of radio and repetitive of dehumanizing words, the role that played into getting any person from the streets to turn into a temporary monster.
Yes. So humans are not created monsters overnight.
Yeah.
There's a process.
Yeah. So it's a template. There's criteria which are recognized as being those steps, and they are, like as you rightly said, they can be quite.
So I don't know that you did this deliberately as a writer, or you brought us a bit of redemption when Paul meets Cassandra.
Yes.
But we know that this is something is going to happen. Yes. So what was it, like some sort of rebirth, or new generation, that there is some sort of hope? The union between Cassandra and Paul and the baby that comes along. It's like,
yes, because although Cassandra is not from Rwanda, she is from an African country, and the fact that he chooses to start a relationship with her and finally leave Victoria to live in with Cassandra is the closest Paul has got to returning home. And there's the hope at the time, and certainly as I was writing the book, I was hoping that Paul would find redemption through her. I mean, things went different ways, so the character made up their minds to go a different way. But at the time, I did think that Cassandra would be would allow him to make his own family and make his own home, to find peace.
Wonderful. And then we come down to a situation where Victoria left her country of origin, a young girl, but through the process she becomes a woman. And she has her brother with her, Paul, but she also has that longing for the brother that became a child soldier that was consumed by this madness. And despite the reader thinking, flipping, please don't write to this guy, don't write. She writes. So can you, yes, the first letter to Benjamin, please. I think it's on page 130. 122, sorry, yes.
So Victoria writes to brother Benjamin. So I need to explain, I guess, that Benjamin was 15 years old, and after the genocide. So you have to put yourself in the mind of when people talk about the Holocaust, a lot of the people after the Holocaust moved away. In Rwanda, people went back to their villages, went back to their towns, went back to their jobs, and carried on living next to, in some cases, the people who had murdered their families. A lot of people were put into jail, and in order for the government to deal with all the people that needed to go through the court, it had taken 3 generations. So they, in some cases, in villages, they adopted Gagaka courts, which are traditional courts where people came and, in a very Catholic way, say, we did bad, please forgive us, and then the community as a whole forget. The problem with that is then it was frowned upon to talk about what had happened, so the survivors found themselves silenced because the government was trying to get everyone to move on and for the country to reunite, to be a nation again. But the problem with that is that there was no outlets for people to go through their grief. In the case of children soldiers, there was a decision made that anyone younger than 15 and under, rather than being sent to jail or to go in front of the courts, were sent to re-education centres where they learn over time, or they relearn over time that the reason that they had acted the way they acted is because they had been manipulated by adults and they'd been manipulated by the radio and so on and so forth. So Victoria finds out that her brother Benjamin, who was a child soldier, is in such has been in such a place. Dear Benjamin, the volunteers from the charity tell me you have been in a rehabilitation centre for some time now. I read that the conditions in Rwandan prisons are atrocious. I'm glad you found a better fate. I hope this letter finds you safe. Much time has passed. I wanted to write to let you know that what happened was not your fault. I know that. You were only a child. We were all just children. those evil men sought to take everything from us. I wanted to let you know that in the end, though, we overcame. Our past was stolen from us, brother. It is up to us what we do with the time ahead of us. Your loving sister, Victoria.
And I love the fact that in all of it, the overwhelming emotion of love prevails. But this idea of African spirituality and that if you are buried in a faraway land, your spirit will forever roam. So, did Victoria go back?
Well, yes. You know she did.
Because we have a shocking moment where we come to where Victoria works and it says closed for bereavement. I'm like, did Paul kill someone? Did Victoria commit suicide? What the heck is going on? Again, I'm not going to spoil it. You have to. You have to read the book. But I have to ask you this question because Wales has a reputation of being a nation of sanctuary. If you go to Colwyn Bay now, there are some graves, African graves from, I think either from Congo or Cameroon, I'm not so sure. And the people keep going to these graves and they perform rituals. Now, performing that kind of ritual you need specific ingredients.
Yes.
So if I were to do it, I would need 7 cloves of alligator pepper. But when we went to Colwyn Bay, they were using Mr. Kipling's. So that spirit, do you go home or you just be spinning around Colwyn Bay?
I think it's the intention.
Yeah.
If the intention is right, the ingredients can be achieving.
Please meet Sophie Buchaillard. The book is wonderful. I don't know. Do you have any questions, or I can just
Yes. You can ask questions. Eric can carry on. You can do them both.
I always have one because I think of them beforehand, and I wanted to. There's
children.
I taught in their school, so
I love the fact that there's like a children's disco next door.
Yes.
I do want to say that I think that's really appropriate. You know, we're talking about this heavy history while the children are playing next door. I think that's been unplanned but quite nice. I think between Victoria and Iris, there's this really interesting contrast between the two journeys that the characters go on. That Iris has been the victim of this awful crime, and she knows exactly what's happened, and she grows and forgives her brother. And while Iris has almost the opposite sort of process. She grows into an adult and then realizes that as she learns more about what's known about the Rwandan history, that perhaps that her family has some culpability for it. I wanted to ask you about that. How did that all sort of emerge into the story? What do you?
So the characters are very different because Victoria, in some ways, is close to a historic character. Iris was more an embodiment of the realization of what has happened, and I talked elsewhere about the fact that one of the reasons I wrote this book when I did is I was on the MA in creative writing, and I was significantly older than everyone else in the course. And when I started talking, I read a couple of short stories about Victoria, and I don't think anyone on the course knew anything about the genocide in Rwanda, which it was after you. Before you were born, significantly. So, understandably, but it struck me that it is one of the last genocide of the 20th century, and it's been kind of lost. It's not studied in the curriculum. We seem to have stayed to the Second World War and everything that happened afterwards. So.
But that's very typical of a European attitude to African history.
Yeah.
So
I think Iris was a way to kind of go on a European journey of, if you actually bothered to pay attention, what would you find out? And if you look past the very generic and very lazy way the BBC and everyone else describe this is a bit weird, describe
That's what you started.
every conflict outside of Europe as being this kind of generic template. You would find out that actually the circumstances are always unique, they're always different, there's historical context that the journalists very rarely talk about. I mean, it's, we haven't done it on purpose, but if you watch what's happening in Sudan, the BBC has been reporting all week about British people being flown home, and that's it. It's getting ridiculous.
A lot of white people learning how hard it is to, without a small boat, to get into the country, It's,
so it's my irony, and I heard on the radio yesterday they were saying, the Parliament is currently passing legislation that it's going to be much harder to follow the rights, to give rights to people seeking asylum at a time when a lot of the people who are coming on boats are from Sudan and that part of Africa. So the government is a bit of a conundrum now. So we'll see.
So just to amplify that point, to be honest, I went to Kigali. It is beautiful.
It is beautiful, yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. However, as a writer, do you think they've painted, it's like when the queen wants to go to a hospital, they have to paint it so that she can't, she thinks that it smells of paint and it hides all these cracks. Do you think this is a deliberate act by Mr. Kagame to wipe the slate clean? But like you said, collective what's the word? Collective, not forgetfulness.
No, not forgetfulness.
Not forgetfulness.
Yes, I think so. I've been wondering that a lot, and he has. So Paul Kagame was with the good guys during. Has been in power for the last 30 years. There's a word for that. There's a lot of people who think he's a hero and he saved Rwanda. There's a lot of people who have some concerns about his human rights record. He found himself in an impossible position, I think, which is I've tried to articulate it for myself, but he had a very divided country. The majority of the population, one way or another, was involved in the genocide, either as victims or perpetrators, or be it both. And he had to somehow reunite his people, and in order to do that, he had to choreograph what happens next. So every year in April, which is when the genocide started, there is huge celebration to commemorate the loss, to commemorate the survivors. There's a reason why the book on transmitting memories has been released this month, because it is as part of the celebration, but it is all choreographed by the government. And one of the questions, and we had that debate on the MA many times, is who am I to write about Rwanda?
I was going to actually ask you that, because so did you have this kind of
many times. I mean, there's three people here who can vouch for many times, in fact. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure for a very long time that it was my place to do it or not. And then so I put the question to Claver, who I was working with, who was himself a survivor, and he said, no, you have to write it because we can't. So what he explained to me is that in Rwanda there is a committee, there is a government-led committee, and the committee decides whether or not you can write or what you can write about Rwanda. So he said there's some things we can write about, but it's within the guidance defined by the government, which is quite limiting. So he himself chose to, he's published 3 books, and he has one book that was published in the Netherlands, which is significantly different from the other 2 that were published in Rwanda, because he can say more being published in the Netherlands than he can in Rwanda. So he has a children's book published in Rwanda, and now an academic book about transmitting memories, which was in partnership with a UK company. And he has another book about his own experience as a survivor, which that one was, he felt he had to have it published outside of Rwanda. So his advice or his view was that it was important for other people to write about it, because I could say whatever I wanted, which also came with huge responsibility, because the narratives between what you read in English and French and the political narrative, which is still very alive today, meant that it's very difficult to know where the truth lies sometimes. So I got 3 survivors to read the whole book to make sure that they were happy with it and they checked the facts. And I'm still, when the BBC article came out, I got some very interesting WhatsApp messages from some very angry people from Burundi who wanted to tell me that I had got it all wrong, and it was very political, so it's obviously a very live issue.
Yeah, obviously this is in the world of academia, they'll be saying, "Oh, you are dipping your ink in other people's blood," so to speak.
Yeah.
But the book works. You know, it works from the point of view of a researcher. The language is simple. Looking at things from the prism of child protagonist works.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend it. Now and then, because you brought it up.
Yeah.
So the government of today has this policy of sending displaced people to Kigali, Rwanda. Where do you stand?
I stand well. In 2021, the UK government sent a report to the United Nations expressing some concerns about the human rights records in Rwanda. They then took the reports down just in time for whoever her name, Braverman, to go to Kigali during the April celebration last year. And it was very interesting actually because when she traveled to Kigali to sign the memorandum, and it is a memorandum because I understand that legally that means that it can't be, it doesn't receive United Nations scrutiny, so the UK has found a loophole in order to do what it wants. But she went in April, which was the moment when in Rwanda people are commemorating the genocide. And the way it was reported in the news in Kigali is in the English papers, there was a big blurb about this great partnership with Britain, and it was all about the future. And you have to understand that so the Rwanda was never a British colony as during the Commonwealth. It's apparently one of two countries. I think the other way is Mozambique.
And I think they've got the presidency now.
Yeah, and so they've got the presidency now. So it was all nicely choreographed for them to sign the memorandum, then become members of the Commonwealth, then get the presidency of the Commonwealth at the time. But in the press in Kinyarwanda, they had a picture of Braverman coming in front of the memorial statue and leaning forward, and the picture gives the impression of the West apologizing, and it was choreographed in such a way at the time that the picture and how it was conveyed to people in Rwanda and how it was conveyed to the international community was very different, which I thought was interesting. But it's a problematic policy that has, to say the least. The template is the Australian model, and there's now lots of research that shows how wrong that went. Anyway.
Wonderful. When it comes to post-colonial Africa, and we're engaging in the world of academia, there's always this idea of white guilt and stuff. And so people will be like, "Oh, Sophie, you didn't have to write this book. Would have been better if an African writer wrote it." That is. Can I say the word that I was going to say?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a swear word. I was going to say that's bollocks. But because it's being recorded, I don't want to use that word.
Too late.
There's a wonderful resolution that goes throughout the book, and I think that is your wonderful gift as a writer. But, you deliberately avoided the use of dream sequence in fiction. However, you engaged us through the ritual of that tradition of using folk tale and storytelling. So where did you pick this up?
So you've introduced me as being born in Paris. What the blurb doesn't say is both my parents were born in Africa, and I grew up hearing tales from African countries. My father and my uncle all worked in Africa. In fact, I told you my cousins were all born in Cameroon.
I have relatives.
And so I've had, and as I said to you last time we had coffee, there's a radio station, it's all about radio stations, but there's a radio station in Paris that's called Africa #1, and it covers the whole of Francophone Africa. And on a Sunday night when I was little, they used to have storytelling hour, and they used to invite storyteller from, so it was a different African country or a different region every Sunday night, and he would come in for an hour and he would tell tales on the radio. So I was in my bedroom listening to that every Sunday night. So I grew up listening to storytelling, and they are very powerful, and they are how you transmit knowledge and history, and they are how to make sense of difficult topic. And the novel is a very individual thing that came at the same time as the nation state, whereas storytelling is all about sharing and passing on to the next generation, and it seems right in a story about children told by children.
Yeah, and so in the end, when Iris is talking to Ophelia, and then Ophelia asks this question: that did Ben finally kill the monster?
Yeah.
Yes, and that is how the novel ends. So thank you very much for your time. This is the wonderful Sophie Buchaillard and Cardiff BookTalk. Any questions?
Yeah.
Go. Yeah.
Or
You go first.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
No, you were both just now talking about sort of white guilt, white man's guilt, and I wanted to say how your character Iris in those scenes in Paris
Yes.
were very interesting. And what struck me was how her attitude towards her own family changes during the course of the novel,
Yes.
and whether that was something that you were determined right from the start to include, or did it sort of evolve during the process of writing, or was it drawing on something personal?
It was drawing on something personal. So Iris is discovering more and more about what happened during the genocide, she realizes, retrospectively many years later, that her father, who at the time worked for the French government and was in a section of the administration that was in charge of African affairs, would have been party to the various conversations that were happening in the French government in April 1994, would have seen what was happening, would have been around the table when decisions were being made. And I think one of the questions she then comes to ask is what share of responsibility did the French government hold, and by extension, what was the personal responsibility of her father? And that's based on real events, because my father was the advisor for Africa in what was called at the time the Ministry of Cooperation, which was an extension of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that was in charge of this policy, France-Afrique. And I remember quite vividly him getting a phone call and him disappearing for a couple of weeks because there was, I can't remember what they called it, the special unit being set up as the government was figuring out what his response was going to be. And as I was doing the research, I read a lot of reports, and then the current president of France very conveniently commissioned a report which ended up being 999 pages long, where he authorized access to the French governmental archives at the time, and a group of historians spent several years looking at those to try and understand what could explain how the French government had got it so wrong. Because to make it clear, the French government supported the Hutu extremists, and they helped the retreat of the perpetrators as the advance of Paul Kagame's troops were liberating the country. And the people who ended up in the camp, they were not the poor survivors, the majority of cases, they were the Hutu perpetrators who were fleeing, protected by the French army. And there's a fairly long blurb, which is a bit unusual for a novel, at the back, where I talk about the finding of the report, but the general finding of the report is the fact that racism in the French government at the time was so rampant that it didn't even occur to them that they might be wrong. They had all the information, they'd received all the reports, they simply did not believe them. And there's quite a strong indictment of arrogance, I think.
And that must have really affected Iris as a person, and made that loss of belief, belief in a father
It's
figure
not
too.
guilt exactly, is it? It's
No, it's
she's learning this for the first time, and it's
well, it's realization that everything that she thought she knew about herself, where she was from, the values that her family held were not real. And that by extension, I think, that by extension, Europe as a whole, its values and everything that we think we know about ourselves and our moral and how moral high ground that we keep pushing back at other people is all based on lies.
Yeah.
And for me, the book works on all those levels. But more importantly, it demonstrates the power of fiction.
Yeah.
Because you can be reading this book and you know that there's that shadow, that monstrosity, that event that happened in the course of how many days, how many hundred people were.
100 days,
Yeah.
800,000 people.
Exactly. So, but you've used fiction, subtlety of language, wonderful characters to paint this picture without making us leave that experience. I think it works.
Yeah.
So I think we should go to a pub in Ely. My local pub is called the Highfields.
Yeah.
We should go and read it in there, because when these things are happening, it just becomes a matter of the Hutus killing the Tutsis.
Yeah.
But a book like this brings it home.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Anyone else?
Yeah, I sort of have a question for both of you really, but I'm going to try and word it in the right way. The book is mostly written in English, but you do include some phrases in Kinyarwanda. So I thought that was interesting. I also know in your poetry, after listening to you present it at open mics for Cardiff University, you sometimes interweave English and other languages together. So what do you think is the importance of bringing other languages, presenting them within fiction or poetry? What do you think is the importance of that?
This is about Sophie today. I'll just jump in.
I think it was important to me to have some Kinyarwanda in there because the Brits on holiday are often accused of making zero effort to try other people's languages, but there is something about each if you speak more than one language, you suddenly become aware of the fact that each language comes with a cultural backgrounds that shapes and frames how you see the world. And it was a way for me to hint the fact that even though I'm writing the story in English, the events, the conversation would have happened in a number of languages, and because in Rwanda at the time, people in school, in administrative work would have spoken French because that was inherited from the Belgian rule. But at home, people spoke Kinyarwanda, so it was the language of the home. It was the family unit who was operating in Kinyarwanda. That was the language, not English, not French, not. So it was. I wanted to show that distinction, and particularly there's a passage where the soldier comes, and the soldier comes speaking French because he's giving him the authority of the administration speaking French, and the mother insists on speaking back in Kinyarwanda. And then they have this exchange where the two languages kind of float. And it was important to me to include that. And it also meant that I had to work with authors in Kinyarwanda to make sure, and they laughed at me a lot because they said, but yeah, so I was able to work with people who could advise me on the language as well. And it was interesting for me to get a sense of how the language is structured. I'm a bit of a nerd.
I just love how. I'm sorry. Victoria says, I want to be a translator. There's so much more to say, and I think that ties in very well with what you just said about languages being sort of the way you see the world, or seeing the world differently through different languages. Sorry, I interrupted.
Language is a complex issue because you have to appreciate the barbarity that it takes for a group of people to go to a particular land and with these people to make them speak in a language that is not theirs. So for someone like a Cameroonian, we speak, we dance between French and English, but there's a language that we speak which is Pidgin, which is a language of protest. But Bantu Bakwiri is mysterious, it's magical. I cannot say Glau elephant. I would say Mbuanjoko, which means rains that are so heavy it feels as if elephants are dancing on the roof. Do you see how powerful that is?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. However, it was until 2016 that I found my voice, that English is not my language, French is not my language, my language is Bakuri, Bantu. But it took a wonderful writer to ask me a simple question. Our friend John Gower, we finished at the Hay Festival and we're driving up to Cardiff, and I'm showing off to him, and John goes, "Oh, Eric, in Cameroon, do you have trees?" You know, there's a size of Cameroon bigger than Britain, which is a forest. So obviously, we have trees. So he said, "Oh, name 3 types of trees." I'm like, no, he said, in your language. So I'm like, we have the Ewu, the Etolongo, the Bangu. So he said, what does this mean? So the Ewu tree, if you came to my house and I don't like you, I'll give you the Ewu tree to build your structure. Because the Ewu tree hides a deadly secret. Snakes, scorpion, all of them hide in the hollowness of this tree. So if the Portuguese decide to come to Cameroon again, we're going to give them the Ewu. But you understand, naming something as it become, you can take these stories to somewhere else. But it took me years to understand that these are not the languages that are natural to me, but this one was. Or you could also adopted the opposite extreme by studying the Russian language that I love. So,
Yes.
It is a beautiful thing. You just tweak a word and it becomes magical. That's
I just wanted to say it was really informative because I knew about the genocide vaguely, like so many people, unfortunately. The way it's portrayed in the press, it's like anything that's outside of Europe, that's sort of in the sort of usually third world countries is considered, not our problem. The problem is too big for us to deal with, type of thing. So yeah, I was talking to my father earlier today, and I was saying, the book's about the Rwandan genocide, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that in the 90s. Wasn't it like infighting or something?" And I said, "Well, actually, it's much more than that." Yeah. So, and I told him about it that it goes back to like colonization and all of that. It's so much deeper. So yeah, it's taught me a lot, and I'm going to try and spread the word.
This is not who we are.
This is not who we are. Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's part of the thing. And I'll say that with my children and I'm here today, but I have 3 children who are ranging from 12 to 19 now. And one of the other things I wanted to this for me was a counter to them spending their life on YouTube and TikTok and trying to remind them that it's important to try and look further and to not just take things at face value, because the internet and social media in particular have made it so we judge things in an instant without really trying to understand the context anymore, and it's incredibly dangerous. So there was something else that motivated this. So thank you.
I'm curious about your writing going forward, because your debut novel is now past.
Yes.
What is the foundation that it provides for your new projects? How do you look on it as a foundation?
Well, thank you for asking. So when I finished This Is Not Who We Are, I don't think I was quite finished talking about the experience of migration, because I'm also a migrant. My experience is very different to that of Victoria, but I've been in this country as a guest, I suppose, for 10 years. And as time went on, it was difficult for me to place myself, and I am the mother of 3 children who are raised in this country. And so I moved on to another novel, which is looking at 3 generations of women in migration from the same family, and trying to look at how we perceive travel in the context of migration, and this weird distinction people make between some people travel and other people migrate, and some people are expats, yes, and other people are not. and where that comes from. And so that's led to what is my second novel, which will come out in February next year, and is currently called Otherness is Its Own Country. 29th of February.
Fantastic.
I don't really have a question so much as Sophie indicated earlier, we've been following this book for a very long time. And it's just amazing to me that all this time later, we're still having such fascinating conversations, discovering new things about it. So thanks so much, Eric, for providing another insight into it. And congratulations, Sophie, on producing such a fruitful book, because we're still learning stuff today, and it's great to hear other people learn stuff, and it's starting conversations. So yeah.
And it is in the acknowledgement of the book, I will say here since you're here, but thank you, Jonathan.
I wasn't reaching for that. Thank you anyway.
Now that you say it.
Jonathan painstakingly read many versions of this.
It was a cheery time.
Yeah. Yes.
I suppose, operating with some insider knowledge, just quickly, building off the back of your question actually, I understand that the novel may be translated soon into another language. Could you talk a little bit about that process and what it brings to it, and what your hopes are with it being translated into another language?
Yes. So for me, this is a conversation starter for people to think and ask questions and try and consider the historical context. It was important for me, so nobody's asked me, normally people ask me, when did I write this in English or in French? Since you haven't asked me one, no. But
So why did you write it in English?
Because I live here. Because I haven't spoken French in 20 years, and my French is the French from the 1990s, and nobody speaks that one anymore, because language evolves all the time. So I speak some sort of archaic French, and nobody wants that. So I'm hoping somebody will translate the book into French, because considering the topic, I think it would be important for people in France to read it, and I would be then more than happy to go and talk to French people about what their past governments did, because one of the things I talk about in the notes afterwards is the fact that governments do that a lot of apologizing for what other governments have done in the past, and there's a lot of research in African universities in South Africa in particular about this sort of Western habit of officially apologizing. There's debates at the moment about that in a different context, but it's a bit of a skewed logic, because you are saying I apologize for what someone else has done, and therefore putting distance between us now, the good people, and those evil people who did bad things before. And what it's stopping us from doing is having reflections on the fact that actually history constantly repeats itself, and we've clearly learned absolutely nothing. And the BBC this week is an absolute booming example of that. And so it's just hypocritical. So it's, and next year is going to be 30 years since the genocide took place. So I'm hoping that I can convince the French publishers to take the book on. And then if it gets translated in other languages, that would be great, particularly in French. I think it would be meaningful, important. So.
This is kind of a random question, just because you mentioned that since you speak like a 1990s version of French, have you ever considered writing like a 1990s novel set in France? Because you'd be uniquely qualified to write that in French.
That's really my next novel for that, but no, because I don't see myself as French at all. That's another story. I'll have to come back to that. So no, but yes, that would be quirky.
Any other question?
Final one?
Well, for writers in the building, read the book. You're going to go on a literary pilgrimage. You're going to go in and out of Rwanda. And if you are lazy, you can just Google what Rwanda looks like now, vis-a-vis what it looked like in 1994.
Yeah, it's amazing now.
This is what I'm saying. You're
Yeah.
thinking, wow, they've put Cameroon to shame.
Yeah, well,
And given that our president has been there since I was 2 years old,
yes.
read the book. And
So, if you haven't read the book yet and you would like a copy of the book, there's some books over there. There's also Eric's poetry collection.
I don't know how my book managed to get on the table.
No. It is pretty special. You know, it's quite amazing, and it is mixing Russian. How many languages do you have in your poetry collection?
6.
6. So it's a linguistic journey, and it is about the stages of your journey from Cameroon.
Those I met, I met Colin and I gave him my first book. The dude sold it on eBay. You know what I'm saying?
It's
2012.
I was going to bring it in to show it to him, but I forgot.
And then all of a sudden I receive an email. He's now VIP. Inviting me to listen. Thank you so much, Mama. Thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure
Thank
to
you
have
so
you
much
here.
for
And
having me.
thanks again, everyone, for coming. It's lovely to see you all. We're doing a thing next week. Is it May the 5th or May the 6th?
The day, yeah, no, 9th.
We can check
I think.
that.
The
Maybe
day
9th.
after the.
We're
There's something
online,
happening on the 8th.
and
I
we're
can't
talking
think
about
what it is.
Watership Down.
Something's happening.
So if this,
The day after.
if you have an
that.
appetite for more, come and see us. We can sort you out for getting you onto Eventbrite for that. But again, thanks for coming. Thanks for bearing with us with our technical hitches this afternoon. And
The disappearing.
big round of applause for Sophie and Eric,
Please take
please.
some biscuits.